You spend years trying to earn the approval of your fiancé's family, only to be handed a piece of paper that says, if it ends, you walk away with nothing. But while I stayed quiet at that engagement dinner, what they didn't know was that I was already planning a funeral, not for the relationship, but for the strategy they thought would control me. The truth is, when you're not chosen to be part of the family, you get to rewrite the rules. And I started with the very pen they gave me. They slid the envelope across the table like it was a menu at a family brunch. No warning. No explanation. Just cream-colored cardstock and gold lettering, neatly packaged cruelty dressed up as tradition. Then she smiled. His mother. The kind of smile that isn't warm, it's polished. Practiced. Predatory. We just want to make sure that, in the event things don't work out, you leave with what you came with. I remember blinking once. Not because I didn't understand. Oh, I understood perfectly. What she meant was, we're going to enjoy your presence, your image, your obedience. But if you ever decide to speak, to want more, to demand space, you're out. And you leave empty. He didn't say anything. Not a word. Not a glance. The man I was supposed to marry just sat there, like a spectator to his own life. Like my humiliation was a conversation he didn't want to interrupt. I wasn't handed a prenup. I was handed a message. You're not one of us. And you never will be. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about power. It was about control. And the way women like me are expected to be grateful for proximity, while quietly accepting exclusion. I looked down at the pen he'd given me when we first got engaged, engraved with our names, wrapped in velvet. Romantic, right? Turns out it wasn't a keepsake. It was a tool. The same pen he expected me to use to sign my silence. But I didn't pick it up. Not then. Not ever. Because something in me snapped in that moment, not with rage, but with clarity. My name is Aubrey Monroe. I'm 32 years old. I've spent my entire life being told how to behave, how to earn love, how to stay small enough to fit someone else's story. But not this time. This time, I walked away from their table, without raising my voice, without slamming a door. And 3 weeks later, I walked into a courtroom with $29 million, a folder of proof, and my own signature. Let me tell you what happened in between. The Whitmore estate didn't feel lived in. It felt displayed, like a museum for a legacy trying too hard to look effortless. The first thing I noticed wasn't the size of the house, or the endless marble floors. It was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. Even the crystal glasses didn't ring when they touched. They just clicked, quietly, like they'd been trained to behave. Grayson had told me his parents were old school. That word does a lot of heavy lifting when you're dealing with East Coast dynasties. The Whitmores weren't just old money, they built the banks. Their name was on buildings, plaques, and private funds all across Newport. Their circle didn't include you. It circled you. The first time I visited, we arrived just before dusk. I remember the air smelled like sea salt and clipped boxwood. Their driveway curved forever, white gravel that crunched under the tires of Grayson's car like we were arriving at a private kingdom. I sat in silence for the last 5 minutes of that drive. Grayson reached over to squeeze my hand. I smiled, reflexively. I'd been to upscale fundraisers, met CEOs, advised clients with net worths north of 8 figures. But something about this visit made me uneasy. It wasn't the wealth. It was the expectation. Inside, we were greeted by Victor, the house manager, who made eye contact with Grayson and eye contact with me. As if acknowledging I was there, but not worth greeting properly. I followed them inside, absorbing every detail, the oil paintings, the fresh orchids that probably had their own weekly courier, the faint scent of lemon polish. Margot Whitmore waited for us in the parlor. Tall, poised, dressed in navy and pearls so subtle they probably cost more than my car. She looked at me with the same expression she probably used to appraise art at Sotheby's. "Aubrey. We're so glad you could join us," she said, her tone polite, her eyes colder than the crystal on the side table. I nodded. "Thank you for having me." Grayson hovered nearby, hands in his pockets, like a teenager waiting to be dismissed. He didn't touch me. Didn't offer an arm. It was small, but I noticed. Dinner was served in the sunken dining room, yes, sunken. As if to physically position you lower. The table stretched long and narrow, making conversation across it impossible. Everything gleamed, silver, glass, porcelain. Everything except the people. Richard Whitmore, the patriarch, greeted me with a firm handshake and a longer stare. "Aubrey Monroe," he said, tasting the syllables. "Grayson's mentioned you." No smile. No warmth. The conversation that evening stayed carefully curated: vineyard acquisitions, philanthropy metrics, a sailing trip off Nantucket. When I brought up a healthcare access project I was working on, Margot sipped her wine and said, "How admirable," then changed the subject. Grayson said almost nothing. And when he did, it was to support their version of the conversation. I sat there, slowly realizing, this wasn't a welcome. It was a measurement. And I was being sized down, politely, exquisitely, and without a single drop of spilled wine. It arrived on a Tuesday. A thick envelope, cream-colored and embossed with the Whitmore crest, sat on my kitchen counter like a relic from another century. No first names. No warmth. Just a return address in gold foil, Whitmore Estate, Newport, Rhode Island. It looked more like a diplomatic summons than an invitation. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it for a while, sipping my coffee, lukewarm by then, trying to pretend this wasn't already something I understood. When I finally did tear the seal, it unfolded like a royal decree. "You are cordially invited to a formal engagement celebration in honor of Mr. Grayson Whitmore and Miss Aubrey Monroe." It didn't say our engagement. It said Grayson's. That wasn't an accident. Not with them. The phone rang an hour later. It was Grayson. "Hey," he said, cheerful, a little too upbeat. "Did the invite arrive yet?" "Just did," I replied, eyes still fixed on the card. Very regal. He laughed, a touch awkward. "Yeah, my mom went all out. You know how she is. It's just one night, they want to show you off a bit." I paused. "Show me off?" He caught himself. "I mean, celebrate. With their friends. Their circle. Nothing big, just formal." I didn't answer right away. He filled the silence. "It's tradition, babe. Just go with it." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But I'd already been to one of their dinners. I already knew what tradition meant to the Whitmores. It meant control, repackaged as class. It meant politeness used as a weapon. And this? This wasn't a celebration. It was a stage. The evening of the event, the weather turned. Light rain swept through Portland as I pulled out of my driveway, coat draped over my dress, hair pinned tight. I drove in silence, letting the wipers beat a slow, nervous rhythm on the windshield. When I arrived at the Whitmore estate, everything looked immaculate. Valets in black coats moved with quiet efficiency. The stone steps glistened with rain. Inside, candlelight flickered in tall sconces, and a string quartet murmured in the next room. Margot greeted me at the door. She wore sapphire silk and diamonds that whispered old money. Her expression, as always, was soft but unsmiling. "Aubrey," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. "We're so glad you could make it." The room was full of people I didn't know, lawyers, politicians, names I'd seen in articles. Grayson stood near the fireplace, drink in hand, nodding to someone I vaguely recognized from a Senate hearing. When he saw me, he smiled. But he didn't move toward me. Didn't take my hand. Just gestured, from a distance, like I was a client arriving late to a boardroom. That moment? That was the fracture. Dinner was served on porcelain bordered in gold. The wine flowed. Conversation stayed light, political, exclusive. I answered when spoken to. I smiled when required. I played the part they wanted me to play. Until Margot stood, lifting her glass for a toast. But before we raise our glasses, she said, voice honeyed and sharp, we have a small family tradition. The room quieted. Victor, the house manager, stepped forward and handed her a black velvet envelope. She placed it in front of me with delicate fingers. We simply ask that new members of the family acknowledge a formality, she said, still smiling. A prenuptial agreement. And there it was. 6 pages. Heavy stock paper. No claims to the Whitmore Trust. No stake in family business. No rights in case of divorce. Nothing. Grayson didn't speak. Didn't reach for my hand. Didn't blink. The pen he had gifted me when we got engaged, a gold Mont Blanc, engraved with our initials, sat beside the envelope. He'd given it to me 2 weeks ago. I thought it was romantic. Now, it was just a tool. A silent demand. Sign this. Stay small. Smile. I looked at the paper. I looked at him. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break. It woke up. I didn't sign it. I didn't argue either. I simply closed the folder, placed the pen back in its velvet box, and looked across the table at Margot Whitmore. Her expression didn't falter. If anything, she looked satisfied, like she'd expected resistance and was already logging it away as confirmation of everything she thought she knew. I turned to Grayson. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the tablecloth, lips tight, jaw clenched like he'd rehearsed the silence and now couldn't find his way out of it. I stood. No drama. No raised voice. Just the subtle scrape of a chair across polished hardwood. My heels clicked softly as I walked past the stunned silence of their guests. A few shifted uncomfortably. No one said a word. I didn't slam the door. That would have been too generous. I let it close behind me, gently, deliberately. By the time I reached my car, the drizzle had picked up. The kind of rain that doesn't soak you right away but settles in your clothes, your skin, your bones. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, engine off, watching raindrops streak down the windshield. The velvet box still in my hand. It was heavier now. Not in weight, but in meaning. They had handed me a contract. I handed them my silence. And that was the real currency of the Whitmore family, quiet compliance. If you smiled, if you behaved, if you kept your discomfort out of sight, you were rewarded. But if you spoke up, stepped out of line, hesitated for even a second, they'd ice you out with civility so sharp it bled. I drove home in silence. Not just because I needed the quiet, but because I wanted to listen. Not to them, but to myself. The next morning, my apartment smelled like lavender and wood polish. I kicked off my shoes by the door, dropped my clutch on the counter, and stared at the folder again. This time, it wasn't just paper, it was a mirror. A reflection of how much of myself I'd allowed to shrink just to fit at their table. My phone buzzed. Grayson. Of course. I let it ring. Once. Twice. 4 times. Then quiet. 10 minutes later, a knock. I didn't move. Then another, firmer. I walked to the door, heart thudding, hand hovering on the handle before I finally opened it. Grayson stood there, soaked through, collar limp, eyes tired. "Aubrey," he said, voice low, "I didn't know she was going to do that." I leaned against the doorframe. "But you didn't stop her." "I didn't want to embarrass anyone." "No," I cut him off. "You didn't want to embarrass your mother." He swallowed. Rain dripped from his lashes. She's always been a lot." "And you?" I asked. "What are you?" He looked at me like he didn't have an answer. Because he didn't. "You say you love me," I said calmly, "but you sat there and let me be humiliated. You watched me drown in that room and stayed seated because it was easier than speaking." His mouth opened, but no words came. I closed the door. Not in anger, but in confirmation. Inside, I leaned against the wall and slid to the floor, knees drawn to my chest, breath shallow. Not because I was heartbroken, but because I was finally, fully awake. And clarity comes with its own kind of pain. I didn't sleep that night. Not out of heartbreak, but because my mind refused to power down. It ticked, calculated, sorted. The way it did when I prepared for investment due diligence or reviewed a multi-million-dollar acquisition file. Only this time, the acquisition was me. At 2:11 a.m., I sat on the floor of my home office, wrapped in a blanket, cursor blinking in the corner of my laptop screen like a metronome counting down to something I hadn't named yet. I opened the folder labeled Engagement. A stupid name in retrospect. But inside were emails, vendor confirmations, catering quotes, event timelines, things I'd barely glanced at the first time because I trusted him. I trusted them. Big mistake. At 2:38 a.m., I found the first red flag. A PDF attachment labeled Internal Planning Notes, Whitmore Gala Merge, Q3 Draft. It had been forwarded by Grayson's cousin Alden 6 months earlier. At the time, I hadn't opened it. Just replied with a heart emoji, thinking it was something about florals or wine. It wasn't. By page 4, my name appeared, cold, bracketed, and referenced as part of a strategic optics advantage. Aubrey Monroe, high-achieving, mixed demographic profile. Strong public sympathy potential. Smart but palatable. Recommended positioning, reformist but Whitmore-ready. I kept reading. On page 6, a clause, if prenup isn't signed by Q2 deadline, enforce clause 12.3 to restrict post-marriage inclusion in Whitmore asset development structures. What the hell was clause 12.3? I opened a separate email from Margot dated 3 months ago. Attached was a legal summary labeled Supplemental Trust Guidelines, Whitmore Holdings, Rev April 2023. Inside, buried halfway through, in small print. Any partner entering into union without signed prenuptial acknowledgement waives rights to executive influence, inheritance claims, and legacy-based equity across all family-controlled platforms. Translation, no signature, no seat at the table. Not even in the hallway. I wasn't being protected. I was being quarantined. I needed confirmation. I texted Talia Ruiz, my closest friend from grad school, now a power player attorney in D.C. We hadn't talked in months, but if anyone could tear this open, it was her. She called at 3:15 a.m., no small talk. You didn't sign it, did you? No, I said, voice raw. Good, she snapped. Because clause 12.3? That wasn't for protection. That was for fencing you out, preemptively. Talia, I whispered, this clause predates the engagement. There was a pause. Then her voice dropped. Send me everything. Now. I did. Every file. Every thread. Every version. At 4:10 a.m., she called again. Aubrey, that clause was filed 13 months before you and Grayson even met. The metadata confirms it. I blinked. What? They filed your exclusion from power before you were even in the picture. This wasn't a reaction. It was a blueprint. I closed my laptop and sat still. I wasn't an accident. I was a plan. And suddenly, it all made sense. The performative dinners. The polite distance. The way Margot smiled when I hesitated to sign. They weren't improvising. They were executing. At 4:47 a.m., my phone lit up again. Grayson. I didn't pick up. Instead, I opened a new folder. Named it Counterplay. Because no one expects the woman who reads the fine print to write her own. I didn't return to the Whitmore estate immediately. I waited 4 days. Long enough for silence to settle into discomfort. Long enough for Margot to wonder if her performance had pushed me too far, or not far enough. I didn't reply to Grayson's texts. I didn't take his calls. And I didn't explain myself. Instead, I wrote. My own document. My own terms. No lawyers from their side. No input from family counsel. Just me, Talia, and the quiet clarity that comes from being underestimated for too long. By the time I walked back into that house, everything looked exactly the same. Too perfect, too polished, too rehearsed. But I didn't feel the same. I wore the same black coat I'd worn the night of the prenup dinner. On purpose. But this time, I didn't button it. I didn't hide. Grayson was waiting just inside the vestibule. His blazer was pressed, his tie knotted just a little too tightly. The tension in his shoulders gave him away. You look good, he said, tentative. Thanks, I replied evenly, stepping past him. Margot appeared from the drawing room, flanked by Richard and Victor. She smiled, like we were picking up where we left off, as if the previous week had been a minor misunderstanding instead of a calculated ambush. We're so glad you could join us again, she said. I brought something, I said, setting my leather folder on the sideboard near the formal dining entrance. Her smile tightened just slightly. How thoughtful. We all moved to the dining room. It was the same table, same lighting, same place settings. But this time, I didn't sit like a guest waiting for permission. I took my seat like someone with leverage. They waited. I let them. Then I reached into the folder and pulled out a navy blue document. Thicker paper than theirs. My name embossed in silver. I set it down in front of Grayson and slid it forward. What's this? He asked. My prenup, I said calmly. A little tradition from my side. The room stilled. Margot blinked. Excuse me? I looked at her. It's pretty straightforward. Shared ownership of any ventures built during the marriage. Joint equity in future investments. Mutual access to intellectual property. And full transparency regarding trust activity. Grayson looked pale. Wait, this cancels the previous. Yes, I cut in. If signed first, it nullifies any prior unsigned drafts. Margot's voice turned brittle. That's absurd. You can't just bring a document in and expect. Why not? I said. Isn't that what you did? Richard cleared his throat like he wanted to speak, but I didn't give him the space. If Grayson signs this today, we move forward. If not, I smiled, we both walk away. No harm. No inheritance. No headlines. Grayson looked at me, then at his parents. I thought you said this wasn't about money, he said. It's not, I replied. It's about dignity. And balance. Then, I placed the gold pen on the table. The one he gave me. The one he thought I'd use to surrender. It gleamed beneath the chandelier like it finally belonged to someone who knew how to wield it. Margot inhaled sharply. Richard broke the silence. Sign it, he said quietly. Grayson stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he picked up the pen, clicked it open, and wrote his name. No cheers. No smiles. Just ink. And a quiet shift in power no one saw coming. The papers were signed. My terms, my name, my pen. But I didn't feel victorious, not yet. Because the truth, the real truth, still lived in the dark. Hidden inside emails, strategy decks, trust documents, and a chain of intentions the Whitmores thought would never surface. They had crafted a campaign, not a relationship. A curated rollout of me, as if I were a product launch, not a person. And I had proof. The morning after the signing, I met Talia at a quiet cafe in downtown Portland. She brought a black tablet and 2 USB drives, each encrypted, each loaded with copies of the internal documents we'd uncovered, plus the ones they'd carelessly forwarded to me thinking I'd never read them. She didn't waste time. They positioned you as an asset, Aubrey. Not a partner. Slide 3 of the Q3 board strategy file literally lists you under narrative leverage. You're not overreacting. You're a case study. I sipped my coffee without tasting it. And if they did it to me, I said quietly, they've done it before. Talia nodded. This goes deeper than just a toxic family. This is institutional behavior. And if you're willing, we don't just expose them. We document it. I nodded once. No hesitation. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, rain tapping softly on the windows. I opened my laptop and created a zip folder. Whitmore_strategy_files, final. 27 documents. Emails. Internal memos. Legal drafts. Marketing slide decks with my name and photo watermarked like I was part of a lifestyle rebrand. I drafted one short message. When families treat people like positioning tools instead of human beings, they don't deserve your silence. I have nothing to gain from this. But others deserve to know. Then I attached the folder and sent it. 3 recipients. A journalist at The Atlantic. An editor at the Washington Ledger. And Professor Elaine Green, my ethics professor from grad school, now a respected columnist and the first person who ever warned me, legacy isn't love. It's leverage unless proven otherwise. I didn't expect the world to explode. But it did. 23 minutes after hitting send, the first email went viral. 40 minutes later, a viral TikTok clip featured a law student standing in front of a whiteboard labeled, Marital Merger Strategy, with my face circled in red beneath the phrase, High Value Optics. By morning, #Whitmore Files was trending. Within hours, sponsors began quietly pulling out of Whitmore Foundation partnerships. One by one, nonprofits and advocacy orgs distanced themselves. A high-profile cancer initiative pulled its funding. A luxury fashion brand postponed a joint gala with Margot's lifestyle division. They weren't frozen, they were hemorrhaging. And still, I said nothing. No press tour. No rebuttal. No comments on social media. Just silence. Because sometimes, silence is not surrender. It's control. Later that afternoon, Grayson released a statement, by video. He stood in front of the fireplace at the estate, wearing his navy blazer like armor. He didn't mention my name once. Just phrases like, emotional complexity, family misunderstandings, and request for privacy. The public wasn't fooled. Neither was I. The next day, I received a private message. From Lucy Harlan, an assistant in the Whitmore PR team. Barely 23, barely seen, and clearly watching everything. She wrote. They planned the engagement pitch before you ever met him. You were always a strategy, Aubrey. I can prove it. I messaged back 3 words. Meet me tomorrow. Because this wasn't just personal anymore. This was systemic. And I wasn't done yet. By the end of that week, I had 2 offers for interviews, 1 publishing inquiry, and a dozen PR agencies trying to help shape my message. I turned them all down. I didn't need a brand. I wasn't a headline. I didn't want to become another sensationalized, wronged woman, feeding an outrage cycle that only rewarded noise. I wanted impact. Quiet, deliberate, lasting. So, I built something. With Talia's help, and with the trust funds my father left me years ago, quietly tucked away in Wyoming, I founded the Monroe Initiative, a nonpartisan foundation to support women navigating financial manipulation in relationships and legacy systems. The kind of women like Lucy. Like the countless names that filled my inbox after the documents leaked. Not victims. Just unarmed. Our first team meeting took place in a shared office space on the 3rd floor of a repurposed courthouse in Portland. The windows were scratched, the lights flickered, and the heat was temperamental. But I stood at the whiteboard with a Sharpie and an agenda. I don't care about sympathy, I said to the 3 staffers seated in second-hand chairs. We're not here to tell women how to rebuild their lives after someone tries to control them. We're here to help them keep control in the first place. No more silence packaged as dignity. No more legalese used as a leash. Lucy was one of the first hires. She came in hesitant, shoulders tight, eyes always scanning the room like she was waiting to be told to leave. But she didn't. She stayed. She became the digital director within 2 months. Because she knew what this fight felt like. I declined interviews. But I published 1 long essay. The Cost of a Signature. In it, I didn't name the Whitmores. I didn't have to. I laid out the framework of legacy families using image-based marriages to reposition themselves in public optics. I gave examples, patterns, tactics. The essay wasn't about revenge. It was a toolkit. A blueprint. It went viral for a second time. By then, Margot had stepped down from her board positions, citing stress-related complications. Whitmore Foundation paused all media partnerships. Grayson, he disappeared from public view entirely. No new cases, no press releases, no more fireplace statements. He did send 1 email, though. Subject line blank. The body, did you ever love me? I stared at it for a long moment. Not because I didn't know the answer. But because he still thought this story was about him. I archived it without replying. That night, I returned to the Monroe Initiative office alone. Everyone had gone home. I lit a single candle by the window, something Marin, my grandmother, used to do when she finished something that mattered. Not to celebrate. But to mark it. I walked to the file cabinet in the corner. Opened the bottom drawer. Pulled out the original Whitmore prenup. Still unsigned. Still cold. Still perfect in its precision. I placed it in a red envelope, labeled it in Sharpie. Closed lessons. Then I shut the drawer. Locked it. And turned the light off on the past. Because I was no longer a woman recovering from a family that tried to silence her. I was a founder. A strategist. A blueprint breaker. And finally, I was speaking, not for applause. But so other women would never again feel like they needed permission to protect their power. It was just past 9 p.m. when I returned to my apartment. Portland was quiet, tucked into itself under a cloudy spring night. I left my shoes at the door, poured a small glass of wine, and stood by the window, watching the streetlight flicker against the pavement. My inbox pinged. One new message. From Grayson. Subject, 5 words. Body, did you ever love me? The same question. The same deflection. Even now, he wanted the narrative to circle back to him. Like this was a love story interrupted, instead of a power dynamic dismantled. I didn't respond. Not out of anger. Not even from pride. But because silence, when owned, is clarity, not avoidance. I archived the message, powered down the screen, and pulled my leather journal from the shelf. The same one I used to write business plans, flight itineraries, and meeting notes. But this time, I opened to a blank page and wrote something else entirely. A letter to the woman I used to be. You weren't naive for trusting. You were generous. You weren't weak for pausing. You were strategic. They called your voice too sharp, because they heard the threat before you did. I closed the journal, breathing evenly. Some people hand you contracts to define your worth. But the real lesson is this. You don't need a signature to make something official. You need conviction. You need truth. And sometimes, you just need to walk away from their table, so you can build your own.